One thing that became very interesting to the Middle Ages was the power of the church. As things got gloomier during the Middle Ages, between plague, between famine, between war, and all the things that are happening, many people looked to turn to an answer. Some people turned to religion and turned to the Catholic Church because they believed that they were being punished by God with all these things happening, and they needed to repent. They needed to get back to the church. Some people simply decided that this was the best way to solve the problems, that praying and things of that nature would bring an end to all the suffering. But the church was extremely powerful during this time because people were looking for answers. Probably no more time, not a bigger time in history that the church was not popular than it was in the Middle Ages. So a couple things that are happening during the Middle Ages that show just how powerful the church is. Oftentimes, the church would crown kings. We'll learn about the Frankish king. His name is Charlemagne in one of the lessons you'll do with me in the small groups, who was actually crowned the emperor of an empire that actually didn't exist anymore. So a lot of times these kings or these lords of these different kingdoms would try to win favor of the church. Most people were more loyal to the church than they were to their kings. So having the blessing of the church, so to speak, was very important to these kings in order to be powerful. Later we're going to talk about, as we get towards the late part of the Middle Ages, is the church was selling indulgences. Basically, an indulgence was a document you paid for. You had to pay the church money to get this document, and you could look at it as a kind of get-out-of-hell-free card. What's happening here is you would come and you confess your sin, and you get a document from the Pope basically saying your sin has been forgiven, you will not go to the underworld because of it, which was completely corrupt because, as we know, or the people who are Christian know, is that the only way you can get salvation is through the Lord himself, not through any human being. So that shows again just how powerful they were getting, that they could actually do that and get away with it. The church became so powerful, you're going to learn in one of these other lessons about the Crusades. Muslims had conquered the lands in Jerusalem and some of the holy places that are important to people who are Christian. They convinced different people from kingdoms, different kings, different peasants even, different knights, to go on these long trips to try to take back the Holy Lands from the Muslims. You'll learn more about this in one of the other activities you're going to do through this process. At times, leaders of different kingdoms would try to get their own people elected as bishops and cardinals to gain church influence. So they would try, cardinals and bishops are official people who work in the church with official positions. So they wanted so much, these kings wanted to have so much influence within the church that they often tried to get people to be put in those positions. Many kingdoms, the church and the government had to sign what's called a concordat, one of my favorite words, which was an agreement. The Pope was so powerful, the leader of the church was so powerful, and the king in some senses, and some of these kingdoms were so powerful, that they kind of argued over control and what they had powers over. The Pope would argue when a certain political issue came up that they had the power in the kingdom, or the king would say, no, I have the power in the kingdom. So the Pope had to sign separate concordat documents with all the different kings of all the different kingdoms that basically outline what are my powers, what are your powers. And there was a lot of disagreement that came out of that. But the fact that the church could insert itself in the political matters, things that weren't church related, shows just how powerful they were. The church became so powerful that corruption started to set in at times, which means there are people within the church who were not being very church-like, right? So they would go accuse people of heresy, which is basically speaking and saying things that go against the church, that the church doesn't believe in. So it's kind of limiting free speech. What happened is an event called the Inquisition. The Inquisition is when the church literally sent out, you could say, teams to these different kingdoms and were punishing people who committed heresy, things that were against church doctrine. Some were tortured even, some were killed. It's not a very pleasant part of church history. It also sounds kind of counterproductive. But the church learned from this. That is why the church is not this way anymore, and why it has changed quite drastically from what happened in the Middle Ages. The final thing that really shows just how powerful the church was its wealth. This image you may not be able to see very well here, but this is a medieval church, a church built in medieval times. If you look at churches from the Middle Ages, I even invite you to search on your Chromebooks medieval churches. I want you to look how huge they are, how beautiful they are, and how detailed they are. You can't do that without a lot of money. People were donating lots and lots of money to the church, and because of that, the church became very wealthy and built these large churches. But also, we're going to learn on top of that, towards the late Middle Ages, some people started to question how the church was spending their money, which led to some problems later. But all in all, during the Middle Ages, the church, as you can see, is extremely powerful. In some ways, getting into political issues, doing things that are kind of corrupt with these indulgences and punishing people for heresy, to the point of actually entering war, having people go and try to reclaim the Holy Lands from Muslims. So as you look through the items on Schoology, you're going to be doing a series of activities, which include looking, I believe, at a PowerPoint that shows how powerful the church is becoming, answering some questions, and also learning about something called monastic life. Monastic life is the idea of living in a monastery and essentially devoting your life to the teachings of the Bible and God. So you're going to get a look at that and see what it would be like living in a monastery, and kind of comparing and thinking about what would be the hardest thing for you to do if you were living in a monastery. So have fun with it and learn more about how powerful the church was in the Middle Ages.